The standard economic models in use today are pretty dreadful. Let's have a look at them in some detail. What are the standard economic models? Well, they're usually referred to as new Keynesian dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, which is pretty much a mouthful. So they are normally abbreviated to dsge models. It turns out that they're not really dynamic, they're not really stochastic, they're hardly general, but in fact they do look for equilibrium solutions, so at least that bit of the title is relevant. What do they consist of? Well, one famous economist, Robert Scheimer from Chicago School, said this: virtually all modern macroeconomic models build upon two foundations. First, households maximize their expected utility, subject to a budget constraint, and second, firms maximize expected profits. This sounds completely believable. People do try to maximize their happiness if they're a household, their amount of money they make if they're a firm, that's fine. But those bland statements cover a multitude of sins. So first consider what it would mean, let's take households, to model their behaviour in this way. So a household has to decide what income it has and how to spend that income over its lifetime. Now, it might decide to spend on purchasing services, on non-durables, on durable goods, on housing, and it will decide on how much work it wants to do in order to generate an income. And in order to make those sorts of decisions, it would have to think about tax rates, what do they expect wages to be in the future, what are prices now, what might they be in the future, how about interest rates, and other associated information. Robert Solow, another Nobel Prize winning economist, puts it: the preferred model has a single representative consumer optimizing over infinite time with perfect foresight or rational expectations in an environment that realizes the resulting plans more or less flawlessly through perfectly competitive forward-looking markets for goods and labor and perfectly flexible prices and wages. There's a lot of really big assumptions in that. People can see into the future over an infinite time period as to what is likely to happen. Markets work absolutely perfectly. The prices arrive at a level so that the exact amount produced is the exact amount bought. If something doesn't quite fit, then prices and wages will adjust up and down to make sure that markets do clear in this way. Pretty obviously, most of that is not true at all. However, assuming that you have one of these DGSE models, then you can get, as an economist, some nice results. Another Nobel Prize-winning economist, I can quote, Joseph Stiglitz, says, the DGSE model gives rise to an equilibrium, which is unique and stationary. That's to say, what will happen according to this DGSE model is that the economy will bubble along in a nice steady state with no terrible recessions, no periods of sudden accelerated growth. And he continues, and dynamics around that equilibrium which are regular and oscillatory. That is, that stable state is essentially undisturbed only by the occasional mild ripple on its surface. So with this sort of model of an economy, what would happen? Well, the economy will just go along, growing slowly over time, very calmly, nothing of interest here, and the only thing that's going to knock it off course or to make any observable change will be some sudden external shock that comes in. We run out of oil in the world, a meteorite lands and destroys half of California, something which then pushes the economy onto a different route. But without those shocks, nothing much will ever happen. So it's hardly surprising, given the way in which those models are constructed and the equilibrium solutions that they produce, that these DGSE models fail to explain any major downturns.
I actually think it's important to have dynamic models, stochastic models, and general equilibrium models. I think all three of those are important. The problem is that the standard dynamic, stochastic, and general equilibrium models makes the wrong assumptions in each of these areas.
And they also fail to see why, for example, when you've got a shock which occurs in this system, why doesn't it get amplified? The shock destroys a bit of the economy. Why doesn't that go on to then affect other parts of the economy? Why doesn't the economy go into a downward spiral and essentially extinguish itself? And why, once you've had one of these shocks, doesn't the economy quickly bounce back? That's what you'd expect to happen if you had a real equilibrium model, but we see in many cases shocks occur. They can take a long time to get out. For instance, the financial crisis, 2007, was still having an effect at the end 10 years later. Let's quote yet another famous economist, dsge. He says, "The kind of fluctuations generated by these models tend to rule out by construction some of the more interesting macroeconomic phenomena, which include the economic and financial boom that often precedes financial crises, with a gradual build-up of financial imbalances leading to an eventual crash. By contrast, existing models of financial crises generally trace crash to a large exogenous shock that impinges on the economy unexpectedly and triggers a large recession." So, these sorts of models are highly unreal. But there's worse. Even as mathematical models, these things are based not on solid mathematical foundations, but on the use of unquantifiable and largely illusory concepts. Let's look in more detail at the basic DGSE 3-equation model. This model, as the name suggests, is based around 3 basic equations. Let's look at them in turn. The first equation is called the Taylor rule, and it relates the interest rate that should be set by a central bank to actual interest rates and GDP. So the equation is shown here, and on the left is the interest rate to be set, and you can see that this is dependent pi t, which is the rate of inflation, r star, which is assumed equilibrium real interest rate, pi star, which is the interest rate that we would like, and yt, which is the logarithm of GDP, and finally y star, which is the logarithm of potential output. We'll come back to some of those variables in a moment to see how real they actually are. The second rule is that this period's inflation depends on current GDP and what you expect the inflation to be in the next period. So again, we show the equation here, and we can see that on the left-hand side you have the current inflation rate, and that this is a function of the expected next period inflation rate plus a portion of the equation depending on the current GDP. Why that should be a good predictor of this period's inflation is a very open question, but we won't argue about it now. This is simply what the model says. And the third and final equation in this DGSE 3-equation model is the dynamic IS curve, also known as the household's Euler equation. Show that here, and we can see that in this case it shows you what the GDP is on the left as a function of what we expect the GDP to be next period and expected next term inflation. Well, if you look at the last 2 equations, we can see that we've always got today's value, pi t or yt, depending upon the next period's expected value, pi t plus 1 or y t plus 1. So everything we do today depends on what we expect to be happening in the next period. And what we do in the next period depends upon what we expect to happen in the period after that. So there's a sort of infinite regress. What we do today is based upon what we expect to happen into the infinite future. This might be a nice mathematical construction, but it doesn't strike me as a very sane appreciation of the sort of decisions that people actually make. And these models depend upon variables which are perhaps best described as unicorn-like. Neutral interest rates. What are they? How would you find them? Do they exist? Potential output. What is potential output? How would you measure it? How would you find it? How would you know whether you'd got it right? These questions alarm a number of practicing economists, but they seem to live with them. For example, Chief Economist of the Bank of England, Hugh Pill, made the following remarks. R star and Y star, in those equations, are not directly observable. They are latent variables surrounded by considerable conceptual as well as empirical uncertainty. Researchers don't always agree on what they mean, let alone how to measure them, and still less what their specific value is at any point in time. In other words, these are just made-up concepts for the convenience of the mathematical equations. They bear no relationship to reality. In more general terms, a previous chief economist of the Bank of England, Andrew Haldane, summed up the problems of these dsge models. The inability of the dsge model to predict the 2008 crisis or to provide policy guidance on how to deal with its consequences precipitated current dissatisfaction with the model. Fairly diplomatic way of saying these models have been useless. So what has the mainstream economic response been to these very considerable problems about the standard economic models? Well, it's been very little indeed. Essentially, it's been to tinker around the edges of these models, to make a few minor adjustments to them, but fundamentally to keep them as they were. They don't address those major fundamental flaws. Are there any economists brave enough to put their hands up and say, stop, we've got real fundamental problems here with the standard models? Yes, a few. Paul Romer, in 2016, said, for more than 3 decades, macroeconomics has gone backwards. Macroeconomic theorists dismiss mere facts, and their models attribute fluctuations in aggregate variables to imaginary causal forces. Professor Storm, 2021, said, mainstream macroeconomics must put dsge models once and for all in the museum of implausible economic models. Rudd said mainstream economics is replete with ideas that everyone knows to be true but that are actually arrant nonsense. And here's the comments of Joseph Stiglitz.
But the point is that the economic losses associated with the financial crisis, the financial instability, were orders of magnitude greater than these fourth order effects that the whole economic profession focused on.
And perhaps the whole set of issues is best summed up by Robert Solow, writing in an article called Dumb and Dumber in Macroeconomics. How could anyone expect a sensible, short to medium run macroeconomics to come out of that setup? My impression is that this approach, which seems now to be the mainstream, has had no empirical success. I start from the presumption that we want macroeconomics to account for the occasional aggregative pathologies that beset modern capitalist economists, like recessions, intervals of stagnation, inflation, stagflation, not to mention negative pathologies like unusually good times. A model that rules out pathologies by definition is unlikely to help. And yet, despite these trenchant criticisms, there's been very little impact upon the economics profession or upon the standard economic models. Romer made these comments.
You know, what surprised me is that I haven't gotten any, critiques back that are responsive to the things I said.
The profession simply turned a blind eye and wasn't interested. All of those criticisms were addressed to elements in the current models. But there's also another question, a very important question, of what's left out of the current models. And the most glaring problem is the absence of the notion of confidence. Business confidence has been known to be crucially important in economic development from time immemorial. In his famous novel, The Way We Live Now, Anthony Trollope, writing in the 19th century, describes the financier Augustus Melmotte. He says, "Public confidence is the essence of these things. Once you have that, you can do everything." He knows that having confidence is the thing that will make other people invest their money. Gentlemen, he says, who don't know the nature of credit, how strong it is as the air to buoy you up, how slight it is as a mere vapour when roughly touched, can do an amount of mischief of which they themselves don't in the least understand the extent. So confidence has been well known to be a critically important ingredient of economic growth and development. And yet it's not in these standard models. And of course, John Maynard Keynes wrote quite a bit about his concept of animal spirits. That's the same thing as confidence. A large proportion of our positive activities depend on spontaneous optimism. If human nature felt no temptation to take a chance, there might be not much investment merely as a result of cold calculation. And yet, despite the importance that Keynes placed on his animal spirits, confidence, optimism, he neglected any really formal treatment of this in his economic writings, and nobody took it up after him, so this gaping hole where confidence should be in economics remains a hole. Perhaps it's no surprise that even if severe criticism of the actual elements in existing models made very little impact on the economics profession, what is missing from those models has received more or less no attention at all. So let's turn to the question of why haven't the fundamental flaws in economic models been fixed? Clearly they're known about. Why not fix them? There seem to be a variety of reasons given. First of all, if you want to model real behaviour, isn't that very messy? Rather than assuming that somebody has infinite foresight of exactly what's going to happen within your model, you would have to go out and see how people make their real everyday decisions. And of course, some people make a decision in one way, some people may make a decision in a different way. So the whole thing sounds as though it's going to get a bit messy and a bit complicated. Perhaps you better avoid that. If you allow a whole selection of different behaviours, then that means that the model you build isn't really going to have a predetermined outcome. The outcome will depend upon how much weight you give to one behaviour rather than another. And that could mean that you could fix it so that the model can give you any particular outcome you desired simply by fiddling around with the bits inside, and that doesn't sound too scientific. And then, perhaps most importantly, if you're used to producing lots of papers using lovely mathematics, it would ruin that wonderful train of mathematical consistency where everybody can use the same sort of equations, the same sort of maths, and they can all believe that they're doing something within an integrated school. So, the whole reasoning from the profession seems to boil down to the idea that at the moment we've got a lovely set of mathematical models, don't mess with them. It's professional solidarity over reality. Why is it that economists thinking this way? Well, it seems to be a question of the sociology of the economics profession. In a science like physics, theories are tested against real-world observations, and if they don't fit, they're either abandoned or they're fundamentally changed. It may take some time for this change to come about, but that's what happens. Old theories disappear, new ones come in their place. But economics has developed a culture where fit to observed economic behaviour is not the main driver, the main constraint on theory. Instead, consistency of the mathematical models and defence of a common professional viewpoint seem to have become the paramount driving forces. It takes a brave economist to speak out against this priest-like edifice. Romer, Solow, Stiglitz, they're all Nobel Prize winners. They can afford to speak out. They've made their professional reputations. Economists lower down the hierarchy. They are going to fear damage to their careers if they speak out against the accepted wisdom of the standard models. So while most sciences have active debates about their models, why can't physics describe 85% of the universe? Economists only debate around the edges of their models. A simple comparison on YouTube of economics against physics. If we look up debates, controversies in physics, we get a whole load of articles with serious debates about fundamentals of the science. Is string theory a good theory? Should it be discarded? Is dark matter something real, or should it be modified gravity? Two completely opposed theories. These sort of questions are actively debated. They're not avoided, and real scientists are happy to join in these debates. But when we do the same thing, looking for debates about economics, what do we get? We get debates about the history of economics. We get debates about historical schools, the Austrian school versus the Keynesian school, and we get debates about political questions that are only half related to economics, socialism versus capitalism, Marxism, for example. Where are the debates about the standard model? They don't seem to exist, at least on this forum. So this difference can perhaps be summed up by an outsider who moved into economics. David Sloan Wilson was originally an evolutionary biologist who became interested in economics. And his viewpoint is this. Economics provides an outstanding example of the you can't get there from here principle. It will never move if we try to change it incrementally. It must be replaced wholesale with a more realistic conception of human nature. He recognized this professional edifice, which is very difficult to move. You can only tinker at the edges, so the only way to make real scientific style progress will be to knock it down and start again. So with these indications that we really need to rebuild economic models from scratch, let's start the process. And the next videos will take us through the process of what to put into a model, how to model it, and result in the running of models that allow us to see realistic economic behaviours. It's a bit of a long journey, but one that's well worth taking.